Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime.
Throughout this episode, you may hear Molly snoring in the background.
Cameron, I need you to take a moment and I want you to think about some of the friendliest people you knew as a child. What made them seem friendly? Do you need a different question?
Like my peers?
No, not like your peer.
Adults.
Adults. Which part?
Adults.
I'm so hyper cognizant of how I speak now that I hear myself on a podcast.
Oh, is it adults? I say adults.
I don't know.
Okay.
It's a lot like the vehicle conversation.
Oh, I'll never forget my cousin saying, "You put the hic in vehicle." I was like,
oh no, how sad. Is this cousin British?
No.
Oh, I was going to make a snarky British comment.
I know. I don't know why you hate England so much.
I don't hate England. I just don't care what they think about us.
Yeah, but not an English cousin. This is my cousin whose dad helped develop Intuit. So
Intuit software. Mm-hmm. Wow. So instead of the initial question,
no, I can do it. People that I thought were nice to me. They engaged with me as a child. They would like play along because a lot of times people would come around and be interested in talking to my parents. Mm-hmm. And so then they would, talk to me and my sister for just a few minutes and then, okay, y'all get out of here type thing. So
I get it.
Yeah, I do it to kids too.
Get the fuck out of here. You know what might even be a better way for me to phrase the question is, what do you know about the trope of luring children with candy?
There's this trope that the people in society that are the most dangerous for children are in some white van, no windows, free candy etched into the side of the van, or let me show you puppies. I've got puppies over here. Or your mom told me to get you. She's at the hospital. Something happened. And so she sent me to come get you. But usually the people who are the most dangerous to children are the ones that are given regular access to them. The parents trust with their children or the parents themselves.
Or other family members.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. And this story, the story I'm going to tell you today about the Candyman murders, maybe will help us understand where the trope of killers in vans handing out candy comes from.
Okay. I've got questions, but I know that they're the answers.
They are the answers.
They are the answers?
They are the answers. Wait, the questions will lead to the answers. The answers will be found.
Your case is going to be the answers to my questions, but they are the answers. The way that both of us just took that statement as if it made sense.
They are the answers.
They are the answers.
The questions are the answers.
The questions are the answers.
There was an unclear antecedent somewhere, and now we're all confused. Verb, noun agreement. No, what is it? Subject, predicate agreement.
Oh, God. Just tell me when this happened.
It's a warm and sticky evening in Houston Heights, Texas, in the early 1970s.
I knew it was going to be the 70s.
Kids coast home on bicycles as the sun dips below the rooftops. Street lamps flicker to life one by one, and the air is filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and something sweet drifting in just from down the street. The aroma comes from a small candy factory where neighborhood children often stop after school, hoping to catch a free treat from the Candyman, Dean Corll.
I have not been able to stop just playing the Candyman in my head the whole time you're talking. Once you started talking about the sweet aroma in the air, immediately.
I don't think I'm familiar with it. To these kids, Corll was harmless, a friendly face, a neighbor with a pocket full of sweets. To the rest of Houston, Dean Corll seemed like an average man. An electrician with a day job who had helped his mother establish a candy business. But behind that welcoming smile, there was something dark and hidden. Between 1970 and 1973, over 24 boys went missing from the Houston Heights area.
More than 24?
Mm-hmm.
In 4 years?
3.
No.
4. Math is hard. Was there something else?
No, that's just a lot in a very short period of time.
It is.
That's more than 6 per year.
Why are you still doing math? Why are you... What are you proving?
I'm not trying to prove anything. It's just something I do.
These concerns, however, were met with indifference from local authorities, who repeatedly dismissed these disappearances as typical cases of boys running away.
What were their ages?
I believe 13 to 20.
What were their races?
Not sure off the top of my head.
Okay. 13 to 20?
13 years old to 20 years old.
Quite a range.
I don't math, so how many years is that? 7 or 8?
Yeah, 7 or 8.
7 or, okay.
Yeah.
Little did anyone know that Houston Heights was quickly becoming the epicenter of one of the deadliest serial killing sprees in American history. The Houston mass murders, as they would later be called, involved the horrific abuse and murdering of at least 28 boys and young men. And Corll was not acting alone. His reign of terror was aided by 2 teenage boys whom he had groomed into accomplices, turning his unassuming home into a house of unimaginable horrors. Today, we unravel the story of Dean Corll, the man behind the mask of Candyman, and the tragic fates of the lost boys of Houston Heights. This is a story of manipulation, betrayal, and exploitation that thrived on the trust of a community. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24th, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Is anything good happening in Indiana? I feel like I've never heard anything good happening in Indiana.
That's because you subscribe to a true crime podcast that is based in Indiana.
Okay, that's it.
They tell a lot of Indiana cases because they're local to them. So it makes sense that you're not hearing a lot of positive things coming out of Indiana when you're listening to, similar to how you're covering a Texas case right now that I've never heard about, I don't think.
I had not heard of this case either, and it's kind of wild.
Right. That's what I'm thinking.
I think maybe this got lost in the shuffle somehow, because I think it also coincides around the same time as John Wayne Gacy.
Okay. Well, but also the Pixie Sticks murders happened in Houston, didn't it?
Yes.
And it was...
And he's also sometimes referred to as the Candyman. Yeah, just like that. Anyways, born in Fort Wayne, Indiana on
Christmas Eve.
Christmas Eve. Why couldn't I think of the word Christmas? And to a family plagued by instability. His parents, Arnold and Mary, had a strained marriage. Often, Arnold and Mary would argue, have great conflict, and they divorced when Dean was just 6 years old. Then, they briefly remarried, only to separate again shortly afterward. Despite the family tension...
Well, you like cases where people remarry somebody they were married to already.
I think it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's a choice.
I think the romantic part of me, the less logical side of me, kind of then starts to put stock into this idea of a soulmate, someone who you can't not be with. But then my logical brain, which typically has more control over my psyche than that whimsical side, is like, what the fuck are you thinking? Obviously, you left for a reason.
Right.
Something's not working.
Yeah.
It doesn't go into great detail about how serious this conflict was, or if maybe there was some kind of abuse in the household. It doesn't necessarily ever really share that kind of insight, but we know it wasn't a good marriage. Despite the family tension, Dean's mother was known to dote on him, providing him with constant attention. Meanwhile, his father was a strict disciplinarian. Again, no evidence that there was overt abuse, especially not anything that was beyond typical for that time.
Which is a loaded statement in and of itself. Was he an only child, did you say?
It seems that way, yes.
Okay.
Following their final separation, Mary remarried a traveling salesman, and the family eventually settled in Vidor, Texas. Dean, is it Vidor?
I don't know, but I'm about to do a case
on Vidor?
there. Yeah.
On Vidor?
Yes.
Wow. Is that the one you're doing next?
No.
Okay.
But I'm about to research it.
Weird. Dean, though a quiet child, was regarded as being well-behaved and disciplined. In school, he maintained decent grades and occasionally dated girls from the neighborhood, giving no indication of the darkness that would later consume him.
Girls?
Girls. You know, we're talking about the 1940s.
But he obviously had an affinity for boys.
Well, maybe. I haven't told you if there were sexual proclivities.
He groomed boys to help him abduct and murder boys.
Maybe... No, I don't know.
Maybe hatred for a father, self-hatred.
There's definitely psychosexual elements to this. As he grew older, his mother's candy business, which was initially named Pecan Prince, became the center of his life, involving him in the family trade at an early age. By the 1950s, Corley's family had established a more permanent setup for the candy business in their garage. Dean worked alongside his younger brother, not an only child,
Not an only child.
operating candy making machinery and helping his stepfather sell sweets on his sales routes. When his mother divorced once again, Dean returned from a brief stay in Indiana, where he had been helping his widowed grandmother to support his mother in launching a new candy venture in Houston Heights. Now, it was rebranded as the Corll Candy Company, and Dean took on a prominent role in the business, earning himself the title of vice president.
Was his dad still in the picture?
I don't know. I think it's kind of weird they went to the name Corll, but maybe because it was alliterative with candy, the Corll Candy Company.
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the choice of victims and all of that you haven't gotten to yet, but I'm like, how did we get here? Because you're saying that the mother was doting on him, and so it seems to me like probably created an unhealthy,
some kind of like Norman Bates shit.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I am going to get a little more into it. Dean's commitment to his mother's candy business gave him a reputation as a friendly neighborhood figure, known for handing out free candy to children and allowing them to visit the factory, where he had even set up a pool table in the back.
You even just saying the phrase, give out free candy to children, there is something so ingrained in the way that society treats that, or at least since I was a child, that spiked something in me. I was like, free candy to children?
And knowing this fucking story, I'm like, no wonder you shouldn't take free candy. What the fuck?
And I don't even know the story, but it's sending something. It's sending alert to me.
Well, all of this led to Dean being known as the Candyman. He became a fixture in the local community, and he was especially popular among the neighborhood boys, who saw him as an approachable adult. But there were early ominous signs that not everything about Corll was innocent. In 1964, Corll was drafted into the U.S. Army, where he served for roughly 10 months. And despite an unremarkable record, Corll successfully applied for a hardship discharge, citing the need to help his mother run the candy business back in Houston. Though his time in the Army, yes, explain your expression.
Whose hardship? Hers?
Maybe? That she couldn't run it herself? I don't know, but it worked. Though his time in the Army was brief, Corll returned to civilian life with a seemingly newfound purpose. Upon his return to the family business, he continued attracting local teenagers to the factory and allegedly began showing a more unusual interest in the young boys, particularly those who were vulnerable or from troubled backgrounds. According to a later account in The Man with Candy, one young boy who worked at the candy company reported that Corll had made inappropriate advances toward him. And when the boy shared this with Corll's mother, she responded by firing the young employee rather than addressing her son's behavior. Over the years, the Corll Candy Company became a popular gathering spot for teenagers, with many of these boys either working at the factory or stopping by after school. Some of them were runaways or boys facing issues at home, young men who Corll quickly built rapport with, even displaying openly flirtatious behavior toward them. Among these young boys was a young teenager named David Brooks. Initially introduced to Corll with simple offers of candy, Brooks soon became one of Corll's closest companions. As their relationship deepened, Corll began to groom Brooks, gradually building his trust over time. By the time Brooks was just 14, Corll was not only sexually abusing him, but also bribing him with money and gifts to ensure his silence. I want to take a moment just to
call back to Caleb Deal.
That wasn't what I was going to do, but you're absolutely right. 100%. Yeah.
What's his name? Howard?
The young boy in the story?
No.
All I remember is Mr. Nakona.
Yeah, something
because that's
Howard.
what they nicknamed him.
Ricky
Howard.
Yeah.
Yes. I want to clarify. Yes, obviously, Dean Corll is sexually abusing this young man, David Brooks. And I needed to phrase it that way because I need to make sure it's understood as sexual abuse, because that is what it is. But part of that bribery was, I'm doing sexual favors for you. So it was money, it was gifts, and from my understanding, it was also Corll. You can be sexually abused, but not understand you're being sexually abused, right? Especially if we're talking about relationship dynamics between a young person or a teenager or adolescent and an older man, woman, whoever, it may seem like you are part of a sexual relationship, that
Right.
there is some kind of love between you two.
Well, because as the teenager or as the young person, you don't necessarily know better in the way that the adult is supposed to know better.
Right. And you don't have a cognizant understanding of that power dynamic.
Right.
Or, like you just said, the appropriateness of something.
Right.
So again, Corll was sexually abusing Brooks and bribing him with money and gifts to ensure his silence. As Corll's grip on Brooks tightened, his intentions became even darker. He began expressing a disturbing interest in abducting and murdering young men, turning Brooks into both his confidant and accomplice. And in exchange for Brooks's continued silence,
This feels like it came out of nowhere. He's like, let me groom this kid. And then all of a sudden he wants to abduct and murder boys.
it leaves me with questions about, did something transpire in the 10 months he was of service in the military?
That's a good point, especially because he doesn't seem like the type that would have. Well, one, I have to assume that this guy is not straight,
Right.
but is not straight in a time where you're not really allowed to not be straight, or to not be not straight, where you're not allowed to be gay. Jesus, I was making that so complicated. And so I don't think, not that gay men wouldn't enlist or anything, but he does seem like somebody who is a little bit more inclined towards things that would be societally deemed feminine, like
Right.
making candy and nurturing young people, and not nurturing, but you know what I mean? Like spending time building relationships with young people. And obviously, people didn't know that he was abducting and murdering or sexually abusing or any of that stuff. What they're looking at from an outward perspective, societally, would be more aligned with somebody who would probably not choose to enlist in the military.
Right. Well, and from a lot of, just to kind of add another dimension, a lot of what's reported is that a lot of these young men, these boys, was that they came from a disenfranchised background of some kind, whether that be economically
But that's
or...
victimology.
It is. It is. But it is hard from everything that I have read to pinpoint a moment when everything goes wrong. And not to spoil the ending, but there is a lot of conversation about, is there only 28 victims?
Sure.
Again, going back to what I was saying about Corll and Brooks. So he became his confidant and accomplice. And then to get Brooks to continue to do his bidding and also keep him silent, Corll gifted Brooks a Corvette and offered him $200 for every boy he could bring to Corll's house. And Brooks agreed. And soon he was actively recruiting boys from their neighborhood, luring them into Corll's deadly trap with promises of parties and drugs. And I imagine candy. It was around this time that Elmer Wayne Henley...
Not Elmer.
Elmer.
No.
Elmer Wayne Henley
God.
entered the picture.
And to think that people say that Texas is not part of the South.
To think that we are so casually dismissed.
Elmer Wayne, even the Henry, I mean.
Elmer. What the fuck? Elmer Wayne Henley.
Oh, not Henry. Henley.
Henley. Where did Henry come from?
I heard Henry when you said Henley.
Okay. Elmer Wayne Henley entered the picture. Henley, born and raised in Houston Heights, came from a similarly challenging background. His home life was marred by tension as he tried to support his mother and siblings while dealing with his father, who was known for his unpredictable and often violent behavior. Dropping out of high school to make ends meet, Henley met Corll through Brooks. Though initially resistant to Corll's advances, he was drawn in by the promise of quick money and, perhaps more disturbingly, the fatherly attention that Corll provided.
That tracks.
Henley would later admit that Corll had offered him $200 for every boy he could bring, a detail that Henley disclosed during his confession. So I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit with that bit of information.
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of reiterate that he was paying them to bring young men and boys to his home. However, Corll was known to pay as little as $5 or $10 to Henley and Brooks, both of whom seemed almost flattered by Corll's continued trust in them. So there was an element of them wanting to perform for this figure in their life for Corll to please him.
Right.
Which is how that power dynamic unfurls.
Yeah.
According to Texas Monthly, Henley even described a feeling or a sense of, quote, cool, close quote, power in following Corll's orders, relishing his own involvement as he worked alongside his mentor to commit these horrific crimes. Henley's disturbing description of his feelings toward Corll and the murders underscored his complicated attachment to the man, who had cultivated a relationship that combined authority, dependence, and then a sharing of this depravity. Together, Corll, Brooks, and Henley created a method of abduction that was as chilling as it was effective. Corll, driving either his Plymouth GTX muscle car or his distinctive white van,
free candy spray painted on the side,
often prowled the streets with Henley and Brooks in search of potential victims.
Prowled?
Yes.
That's such a specific word.
It feels appropriate.
Yeah.
They would lure boys with promises of parties, drugs, candy, or even just a friendly gathering, enticing them, again, with candy, alcohol, or marijuana.
Wouldn't they be just offering all of them? Hey, we're going to have a party. We're going to have drugs and alcohol and homemade candy.
This is going to sound so fat. It's going to sound so fat. But if someone rolls up and invites me somewhere and I know that they own a candy factory and they're like, hey, we're having a party and you can have all the free homemade candy you want.
Depends on the candy.
I would have to have a real conversation with myself. Is it a fudgery? Is it like, is there going to be every kind of fudge I ever wanted? Like, anyway, not to make light of this very serious and awful situation.
No.
But
I think you're just highlighting the effective way that it operated.
It was great marketing. Like, if you're talking about 13 to 20-year-old boys and young men, drugs, alcohol, candy, that sounds like that is a party.
To me, okay, 70s, yes, drugs and alcohol. 50s, candy.
Like, what is it? What kind of, like, vaudeville minstrel music playing in the background? A silent film where someone's handing out candy. Is that earlier than the 1950s?
I think so. I'm just thinking like Leave It to Beaver type stuff. I guess also Lucy working in the candy factory.
The trio used these exact tactics repeatedly, again preying on boys between the ages of 13 and 20, many of whom were familiar faces in their very own neighborhood. One of Corll's earliest recorded victims was a young man named Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student who went missing while he was hitchhiking from Austin to Houston in September of 1970. Conan, possibly on his way to visit his girlfriend, was picked up by Corll, who likely offered him a ride. He became the first known victim in what would be a terrifying killing spree. By 1972, Corll's operation had reached new levels of horror. Not only would Corll and his accomplices lure boys into his home, but they forced many of them to write postcards to their families, falsely claiming they had found work elsewhere and were doing fine. One of the most notable instances of this manipulation was in the case of Mark Scott, a 17-year-old boy who went missing in April 1972. Days after his disappearance, his family received a postcard from him, supposedly written from Austin, claiming that he had found a job paying $3 an hour. However, Scott's parents knew that something was wrong. They believed their son wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Unfortunately, the Houston Police Department dismissed their concerns, categorizing Scott as a runaway and ending their involvement in his case. I didn't include information from this documentary episode from ABC 13 Houston, but there was another instance, and there's only one surviving set of parents left from these 28 young men that we know were abducted and murdered. Mm-hmm. And this one surviving set of parents talked about how frustrating it was to work with the Houston Police Department because they did nothing. They said, oh, your son ran away.
Right, which was an easy way to not have to add anything to their workload.
And you can hear the frustration and the sadness in his parents' voice as they give this account about how they knew better. They knew that their son would not run away, but no one would listen. Houston's law enforcement during this time exhibited a pattern of apathy toward the families, consistently treating the disappearances as runaway cases without doing any further investigation. Many families desperate for answers took matters into their own hands. One father, Everett Waldrop, recounted that he spent 8 months pleading with the police to investigate his son's disappearances, only to be told repeatedly that they were just, and excuse me if I wasn't clear, multiple sons' disappearances.
Okay.
Only to be told repeatedly that they were just running runaways. Tragically, Waldrop's two sons, 15-year-old Donald and 13-year-old Jerry, were among Corll's many victims. The Houston Police Department's lack of attention and resources to address these missing person cases underscores the systemic failings that allowed Corll's killing spree to continue unchecked for years. For Corll's part, he had really nailed how to hide in plain sight. He changed addresses frequently, staying at various apartments and rental homes across Houston, rarely lingering in any location for more than a few weeks. This transient lifestyle really allowed him the flexibility to not be followed or draw any kind of suspicious attention. And in these new settings, Corll set up gruesome tools. There is an infamous torture board, which was a large wooden plank with handcuffs and ropes affixed, where he would restrain his victims for hours, sometimes days, before ultimately ending their lives. The level of planning and methodical execution pointed to a deeply disturbed individual, capable of manipulating others to satisfy his dark desires. The torture board became a chilling symbol of Corll's brutal methods. Bound and gagged, victims endured unspeakable horrors. Some were strangled, others were shot. After the murders, Corll took painstaking measures to conceal their bodies, using various locations to bury his victims. He began with the rented boat shed on Silver Bell Street in southwest Houston, where he stored most of the bodies. He buried them in the dirt floor. Later, he expanded his burial sites to isolated areas near Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island Beach along the Texas coast. Over time, these burial grounds would reveal the true extent of Corll's murderous spree. In what I read, there is mention made that his accomplices, these young men that he groomed into helping him, would also join in on the torture.
Yeah.
And while it doesn't necessarily explicitly say there was sexual abuse as part of this torture board, I think most of us can work under the assumption that that was sometimes part of it as well. Each new victim had a story and a family left behind, desperate for answers. David Brooks, once Corll's favorite, was largely responsible for introducing Henley to Corll. And initially, Henley believed that they were engaged in some kind of lucrative, albeit illegal operation. And Corll told Henley at the beginning of their time together that this was a, quote, pornography ring, close quote, telling the boys they were procuring victims to be sent to this pornography operation. Corll even, again, paid Henley and Brooks small amounts for bringing those friends to his home under this pretense. When I just said that once Brooks had been his favorite, it's because Henley started to take on the mantle of being Corll's favorite. He was more willing to engage in the depravity than Brooks was. According to Texas Monthly, Henley's recollections of his own actions revealed a chilling acceptance of violence. In later interviews, Henley described feelings detached from his actions, stating that he didn't feel any remorse in the traditional sense. He admitted to feeling, quote, fascinated by the physical struggle involved in killing someone, that saying that television made it look easy, when in reality, he found that it often required two people to restrain and kill a victim. For Henley, this chilling indifference was a byproduct of his environment, his family that was so unstable, his loyalty to Corll, and it's postulated this kind of sense of needing to belong to something that was more than just himself.
Yeah, I think there's also probably a level of competition between Henley and Brooks that is maybe not ever addressed, but it seems like if Brooks was the favorite, then Henley would make it a point to be more involved and do more than, so that he could then step into that role himself. So I think that could have also played a role in the degree to which he was willing to participate.
I'm glad you bring that up because, like I mentioned earlier, Henley came to see Corll as almost a fatherly figure. And so it makes almost kind of this like sibling rivalry. I know that's what you just discussed, but just pointing it out in a different way.
Well, in a familial way, because I wasn't thinking of it necessarily that way, but definitely you can see a sibling rivalry aspect to it.
Yeah, there is a familial dynamic.
Yeah.
Even though it's not under normal familial development.
Right.
In an eerie quote, later reported by Texas Monthly, Henley revealed his mindset during the murders and is quoted as saying, "You either enjoy what you do, which I did, did or you go crazy. So when I did something, I enjoyed it and I didn't dwell on it later.
Yeah, I mean, just survival.
This disturbing statement underscores the depths of how desensitized Henley had become. Despite having been one of Corll's own potential victims, Henley had crossed a boundary from which there was no return, helping Corll turn their friends and neighbors into prey. In some of the research that I conducted, it really began to form that one of the more tragic aspects of Corll's crimes was he really managed to find a way to exploit a community that was already fractured by poverty and social instability. So Houston Heights itself had begun as a bustling working class neighborhood, but by the late 1960s, it was in severe decline. And many of the boys who disappeared came again from those troubled backgrounds or, quote, broken homes, making them particularly vulnerable. Corll's familiarity with these young men and his willingness to befriend them and his apparent stability as an adult figure allowed him to ingratiate himself within that very community he had preyed upon. He also would offer small jobs for small amounts of money, trying to find other ways to leverage trust in the community. It's also documented that there were rumors of Corll's inappropriate relationships with teenage boys and his penchant for luring them with promises of gifts and money. But he had developed that kind of sense of respectability amongst his community, which pretty effectively shielded him from further investigation.
Right.
And a former acquaintance of Corll's, who would only be identified as Guy, would later recount that Corll avoided openly gay bars and spaces, keeping his private life highly compartmentalized. Quoted as saying, Dean was always concerned with how he looked and wanted people to think he was respectable. By early 1973, Corll's reign of terror was beginning to take a toll on his young accomplices. Brooks, who had once been Corll's closest companion, started distancing himself, perhaps recognizing the horrors he was helping to facilitate. Henley, on the other hand, became more deeply involved, actively bringing more boys to Corll's home despite being aware of what awaited them. He fully knew it had become torture and murder. In a later interview with All That's Interesting, Henley recounted the night that would ultimately end Corll's life. On August 8th, 1973, he brought two friends, 17-year-old Tim Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams, to Corll's home for what he claimed was just a casual gathering.
Is Rhonda female?
Yes.
Is that the only female potential victim that was lured in?
Rhonda, what is the commercial where it's like, I need cash now, J.G. Wentworth.
Not a sponsor.
No, not a sponsor. We have none, so if you're interested.
We're open to sponsors.
we would love a sponsor. J.G. Wentworth, if you're listening.
877 cash now.
There you go. Wow, that was free advertising for them. So, 17-year-old Tim Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams were led to Corll's home for what they thought was a casual gathering. Rhonda had nowhere else to go that night. Her father had been drunk and belligerent, and Henley, who was concerned for her safety, invited her along. However, this decision enraged Corll, who had strictly forbidden Henley from ever bringing any girls to his home. Ignoring Corll's anger, the group began drinking and huffing paint.
Ignoring his anger?
Yeah.
But he became enraged, you said.
Yeah, that's what's reported. Again, the group began drinking and huffing paint, eventually falling asleep. Henley would later describe waking up to find himself bound at the wrist and ankles, with Corll standing over him, shouting and waving a .22 caliber pistol. I'm going to kill you all, Corll reportedly shouted, but first I'll have my fun. Desperate to survive, Henley pleaded with Corll to release him.
He may have had control issues too. The one time they violate one of his rules.
It makes me curious how he interacted with women in general.
His mommy was the son, and no one could compare to her.
So do you think he just wouldn't talk to women in general? Did he avoid them?
He can't avoid them. He sells candy.
So why was this so triggering? Is it because it was his hideaway, his safe space, where he conducted his quote business?
So you said that there was no documented sexual element to these attacks, the
Correct.
torture and whatnot, but that you assume that there was a sexual element to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think he doesn't have have any sexual desire for a female. So it takes out the fun or whatever it is that he's getting out of.
The gratification piece is missing.
Right, because it's a female. And so then it's not enjoyable to torture and kill because there is no desire for her.
Just killed her and not worried about. That sounds terrible. I don't want anyone to think that's what I'm advocating for, but it was such a wild response to a problem he'd fixed many, many times before.
Okay, but he makes candy, which to me sounds like he's somebody.
Okay,
I know you're laughing.
sure.
No, it's making candy is something that's very methodical. And so if
Yeah.
he's a methodical person, having to do something that disrupts that method obviously could have been very triggering for him and caused him to.
So you think it was an issue of rigidity where he couldn't disrupt his process?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. If you're in the business of killing people, I feel like you got to be able to roll with the punches. You've got a fucking torture board and you can't handle the unexpected surprise of a female in your presence.
But you have two accomplices. Well, because, okay, so he doesn't want to kill her because there is no procedure or gratification for that. There is no methodology.
There's no meth.
Hey, we don't know. He was promising drugs and alcohol and candy. There was no methodology for that.
I bet you could cook some crazy meth in a fucking candy factory.
Oh, God. You sound like a murderer and like a meth cooker right now.
Sorry, this guy doesn't sound like he was limited by imagination or lack of one. Anyway, continue.
Although he definitely does seem like he was, because he could not imagine.
He couldn't fucking handle Rhonda.
Yeah, Rhonda really was the undoing of him. So I guess if you're in the business of killing, to your point, adding somebody else that you're not getting the gratification out of, I imagine that the reward does not outweigh the risk when you don't get any gratification out of that murder. So you don't want to do that. But then if they brought a guy and Rhonda, then he does want to kill that guy. But now there's a witness. So it disrupts the whole thing because now he's lost a victim and he's got to have some level of need. I'm sure they're not just bringing them like periodically. It seems like he's probably ramped up quite a bit. It probably wasn't as frequent in the beginning as it was towards the end because we know that the cooling off period shortens over time for serial killers.
Your ADHD triggers compulsions, like wanting to sing songs. My ADHD made me fade in and out the entire time you were just talking.
Okay.
But I did hear
that I said words.
Yes. Yes. Well, now you said that and I can't remember what I had remembered.
Shall I say it all again?
Please don't.
Because I don't know what I said to say it again.
Well, that's where I'm at now. I don't know what you said, but I was listening most of the time. And you said something that I thought was really insightful. And I was going to say that really stuck out to me.
Period?
Although it was about forensic pathology.
Forensic psychology?
Forensic psychology. Okay. Desperate to survive, Henley pleaded with Corll to release him, proposing that they would kill Williams and Curley together. And surprising Henley, Corll agreed, and he freed him and handed him a knife. Corll then led Curley and Williams into the bedroom, securing them to the torture board. And as Corll prepared to begin his assault, Henley made a decision that would end Corll's terror forever.
Yeah, you already mentioned that he dies.
Henley managed to retrieve the .22 caliber pistol Corll had left on a nearby nightstand. Steeling himself, he pointed the gun at Corll and ordered him to stop. Corll, unfazed, dared Henley to shoot, taunting him, "You won't kill me." But Henley, visibly shaken but resolute, pulled the trigger, firing several rounds. Corll stumbled, trying to reach for Henley, who continued firing until Corll finally collapsed, his reign of terror over. For the first time in 3 years, the horror in Houston Heights had ended, but the revelations that followed would shock and scar the community. When police arrived at Corll's home, they were met with a grisly scene. Corll's body lay on the floor, riddled with bullets, while 3 terrified teenagers waited outside. Henley was shaken and sobbing, confessed to what had happened, detailing Corll's crimes and his role in them. And as the police processed the scene, they discovered evidence that corroborated Henley's story, including the torture board and various tools used to restrain and harm the victims. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm wondering where Brooks is, if this was just Henley. You know, you said Rhonda just didn't have anything else going on, so she came along. So was this just hey, let's go over here and get high and drunk? Or
Well, and remember, Brooks had started to distance himself.
I know that he had started to distance himself, but I guess it's interesting to me that there are potentially instances where only one of the boys would have been present, not...
I will say this.
Because I think I'm thinking of this maybe more as like a movie than real life. Because even the way that you just described that whole scenario, you see that in movies where somebody becomes maybe disenfranchised with the whole process of everything that's gone on, and they realize how quickly this person that they trusted or that they were under a spell of basically would turn on them. And so that's why when he was like, you won't shoot me, because he knew that he had control, but he didn't realize that he had lost control in the moment that he had tied up Henley.
Right.
And when Henley realized, oh, there's really nothing standing between me and these victims that I have been bringing to him. At some point, I will probably become one of them myself.
Right. It's like a cinematic or dramatized epiphany that's kind of described. And I think one of the reasons why I'm able to give you so many details on Henley versus Brooks is that Henley has been an open book when it comes to interviews and like talking with Texas Monthly all the way back in 1976 and still being willing to discuss.
Well, and Henley is the one who said you enjoy it and you don't think about it later on, correct?
Correct.
So what he's really talking about is dissociating.
Right.
And compartmentalizing. He's not really saying that he enjoys it.
Yeah. And then Brooks has never done an interview. Will not talk about it.
No, he had already started to withdraw.
Yeah. As the investigation unfolded, Henley led police to the boat shed Corll had rented on Silver Bell Street, where he claimed the bodies were buried. Accompanied by Brooks, who had finally confessed to his own involvement, police discovered a harrowing sight beneath the floor of the shed. Wrapped in plastic and laced with lime, the decomposing bodies of 17 boys were unearthed that day, a discovery that would lead to a total of 28 victims being identified by the end of the investigation. The fallout was immediate. Media descended onto Houston Heights covering the story of the Candyman killer and his young accomplices, both of whom were promptly arrested and charged. The trial that followed was one of the most disturbing in American history to that point, exposing to the public
Probably not just to that point. I mean,
True.
But it's baffling that I've never heard about this.
It's serial killing before serial killing was nomenclature, before we had a word for it.
Right. I mean, the word did not create the phenomenon.
No, but it wasn't a part of the American lexicon or the shared knowledge that there were serial murders.
Right. I just don't understand, is it because because you were saying that Gacy was happening at about the same time. Is it because Gacy had more victims, but only by a handful?
There's literally, I didn't read the article because I was like, I don't have time to waste on John Wayne Gacy right now. But there's literally, I think, a handful of articles, and one of them is called The Clown and the Candyman, and it draws parallels and connections and explores how the two are interconnected. And I didn't read it. But yes, there is some evidence that supports that idea. Okay, back to the trial.
I think I know why Gacy would be more widespread than the Candyman, because I guarantee the way that the Houston Police Department tried to discredit these reports of missing kids, whereas in the Gacy case, the police had basically figured it out. They just needed evidence. And so there was this cat and mouse game that they were playing, but because the police did not discredit and disregard the circumstances surrounding all of those boys being missing, and they discovered the boys' remains
under his home, right?
Because they came to the house and one asked to use the bathroom, and as they flushed the toilet, the central heat kicked on and it wafted up the scent of decomposing bodies. And if it hadn't been for that, because that's what gave them the information needed to get a search warrant, but if it hadn't been for the timing of all of that, and if Gacy hadn't been so cocky.
Did Gacy have a different name, or does he have a serial killing moniker, or is he just John Wayne Gacy?
I think he's just John Wayne Gacy.
And
he had a clown name, I think.
Did he engage in gameplay with the local police department, calling them or sending them letters?
I think that's more BTK and Zodiac.
I get BTK and John Wayne Gacy confused.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think they're both Midwestern boys.
Their cases are intermingled in my mind, and there's crossover. I don't always remember the difference between the two.
Yeah.
We are not talking about John Wayne Gacy or BTK, but I understand what you're saying.
No, but I think that the reason that this would not be so widespread is because I imagine HPD would try to downplay as much as possible to keep it from pointing out their failures.
Well, and that's exactly, it's funny you say that because that's my next line. Exposing the public to the grim details of Corll's methods and also the systemic failures that had allowed these murders to go on for so long.
Yeah.
As the investigation continued, more bodies were uncovered. Each exhumation unraveled another piece of Corll's horrific network of terror. Many of the boys had been bound, gagged, and brutally tortured. Corll's particular cruelty was further revealed by the state of the victims' remains. Some had even been mutilated. Again, many were found in plastic sheeting, surrounded and covered in lime to speed decomposition and mask the smell. Back to Jeffrey Conan, our first victim that was identified. Again, he's the earliest recorded victim. Parents who had tirelessly searched for their sons, distributing flyers and appealing to the police, were now given the confirmation they feared. Among these were the families of David Hilgeist, Gregory Malley Winkle, and Frank Aguirre, all young boys with connections to Corll's accomplices. The horror did not stop with the boat shed. Following leads provided by Henley and Brooks, investigators searched for bodies near Lake Sam Rayburn, an isolated and desolate location far from Houston. Henley's chilling recount of Corll's meticulous methods shocked investigators. Then came High Island Beach, another remote site where Corll had buried some of his victims. And as the investigation expanded, it became one of the largest and most grueling forensic efforts of the time. In all, police recovered 28 bodies, though some believe the number of victims may have been even higher. Henley's own defense lawyer once suggested that there could be as many as 40 or more victims, which to me sounds like there were probably 40 and maybe even more.
But where were the other bodies?
I don't know.
I mean, that's at least 12 bodies.
Right. Despite the extensive recovery efforts, the remains of additional victims could not be conclusively identified, leaving questions and open wounds for families still missing their loved ones. The testimonies from Henley and Brooks during their confessions painted an image of Corll that was, for you and I, we know he's dark already at this time.
Yeah.
For years, Corll had manipulated and exploited both Brooks and Henley, grooming them not just as accomplices, but as active participants in the violent fantasies. Brooks, who had been one of Corll's earliest targets, described his complicated feelings of fear and loyalty to Corll, claiming he had initially brought boys to Corll under the assumption they would be a part of a criminal ring. However, once Brooks understood the truth that Corll was murdering these boys, he was too entangled to escape. Despite this, he continued his participation, bringing in more boys and assisting with the concealment of their bodies. Again, Henley reiterated that he had been lured in by the promise of money and that he had eventually come to enjoy helping Corll restrain and assault the victims, going back again to that quote that was shared earlier. The prosecutor later described Henley as being cold, methodical, and completely indifferent to human suffering. In the aftermath of Corll's death, both Henley and Brooks were charged and brought to trial. I am not sad that Henley killed Corll, but there's something really sick about the fact that his two groomed accomplices ended up living and having to pay a price of justice, and Corll never had to.
Right. How old were they?
I think they were still young men at this point in time. Not that they were teenagers anymore, but they weren't.
But how old were they when they started?
Brooks was 14.
And what about Henley?
I'm not sure. Henley faced the court first. He was charged with 6 murders and ultimately received 6 consecutive life sentences. Throughout his trial, he remained defiant, showing little remorse for his role in the murders. In one particularly chilling interview, he admitted that his only regret was that Dean Corll wasn't alive, so he could, quote, tell him what a good job I did killing him. These words struck many as a testament to how deeply Corll had warped Henley's sense of morality. The trial of...
I think to the point of what you were saying before as well, that Brooks and Henley had to pay for these crimes and that Corll never did, I imagine that because Corll was not alive to stand trial, that the boys had more severe sentences.
The bounty was higher.
Right, because somebody has to pay.
And it's not to say that they didn't deserve it.
Yeah, but if he was 14 when it started.
Well, really, and it kind of sounds like it started happening at 13, but that 14 was like full-fledged.
Right. So he, under the guidance, control of an adult man, was committing these crimes after the guy groomed him. And I mean, I think if it happened in 2024, it would be a very different courtroom scenario.
It's wild when you contextualize it in modern day terms because you think these crimes took place over 4 years. So Brooks was only 18 by the time it concluded. Mm-hmm. Wow. The trial of David Brooks followed shortly after, and though he tried to distance himself from the actual killings, claiming he had only helped Corll with procuring boys and disposing of the bodies, he too was convicted. He received a life sentence for his involvement, with the judge citing Brooks's complicity in the abductions as sufficient cause for a severe punishment. Although Brooks expressed regret for his actions, he also attempted again to downplay his involvement, presenting himself as a reluctant participant under Corll's influence. While both Henley and Brooks were sentenced to life imprisonment, the impact of Corll's crimes was far from over. The families of the victims continued to mourn, attending each parole hearing to voice their opposition, ensuring that neither Henley nor Brooks would ever be released. In an unusual twist, Henley's notoriety led to a career in prison art. Despite his grim legacy, he began painting, mostly non-violent subjects like flowers and landscapes, sparking controversy when some of his pieces were offered for sale.
Mostly nonviolent?
Yes. I don't know what that means, but that's what I captured.
And did you say that they were trying to get them sentenced to life without the opportunity for parole? Were they successful?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
Actually, I don't think they were successful. Like, I think there were opportunities for parole, but neither ever escaped prison. Like, victims' families attended their parole hearings.
How do you feel about that?
That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
Because if I were the victims' families, that's absolutely what I would want. I wouldn't want them to have an opportunity to ever commit a crime like that again. By the same token, these were children who were groomed to do these really awful and terrible things.
I think with the removal of Corll, that they are so substantially less likely to ever do anything like this. And I think that they wouldn't have been likely to do it without him from the beginning.
Yes. But the fact of the matter is that he did exist, and they did do it.
And they did participate after he groomed them to. And I think the biggest hang up that I have, aside from like their age, the part that is the most disturbing to me is that they were the ones who selected the victims and brought them to Corll. And so I would want them to be responsible for that, even though I don't want to get into fucking Manson too, but Jesus Christ.
Also, Henley, I'm fine with Henley never getting paroled.
Yeah.
He spoke in a way where he talked about, and of course we're talking about dissociation, but that he enjoyed what he did. Mm-hmm. And then essentially that he had no regrets. Other than he wasn't able to tell Corll himself how good of a job he did killing him.
Well, and the ramping up and
becoming an active participant in the torture board.
Right.
So I'm fine with that element. I think for Brooks, it feels a little less fair, a little less just.
Yeah.
But I'm not losing sleep over it.
Yeah. I imagine that Henley was also older when he started, which means he probably had more of a sense of this is right versus this is wrong. And it's not to say that at 14, Brooks wouldn't have had that.
Henley was 15 years old when he first started helping Dean Corll in 1971.
And Brooks was 13 when he started being groomed by Corll, or 13 when
he was only 17 when he killed Corll and called the police.
So he'd only been doing it for 2 years.
David Brooks was 12 years old when he first met Dean Corll in 1967. Brooks began his involvement with Corll's crimes a few years later. Brooks and Corll's started a sexual relationship or sexual abuse when Brooks was around 14 years old, around 1969. In December 1969, 1970, when Brooks was 15 years old, he discovered Corll sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys. And this event marked the beginning of Brooks' complicity in Corll's crimes. And by the time Brooks was introduced Elmer Wayne Henley to Corll in the winter of 1971, he had already assisted in luring at least 7 teenage boys to Corll's various addresses.
So was Elmer supposed to be a victim?
I'm not sure. It seems like they were both 15 years old, or 15 and 16, because Brooks was about 18 or was 18 when Corll died. So he was a year older than Henley.
Or months older.
Yeah. That's good stuff. I wish I would have included that in my original script. I'm glad I looked it up. I think it does contextualize in a helpful way.
Yeah, I think that there's a big difference between a 12-year-old who is being groomed by a guy and then somebody who comes into the picture at 15. There's a 3-year window where he's able to groom him and he's sexually abusing him, but the boy is not viewing it as that. He's viewing it as a sexual relationship, and so it's...
And there is immeasurable development between the ages of 12 and 15.
Yeah.
So back to Henley and his prison art.
Mostly nonviolent.
Henley's paintings garnered media attention and public outrage, with many considering the sale of art as a final insult to the families of his victims. Texas, like several states, and I've never heard of this, lacked a, quote, son of Sam law to prevent criminals from profiting off their notoriety.
I was going to say, he's not profiting off of the crime. Mm-hmm. He's profiting off of, but he is.
Yes.
It's the notoriety from the crime. But you can, I think, profit from something that's not directly related to the crime, even under the Son of Sam law, if I'm not mistaken. We've really hit all of the big ones today, haven't we? Let's just mention Ted Bundy for fun. And what's his face? Jeffrey Dahmer. All right, we've hit them all.
There we go.
Good night. Jack the Ripper.
Aren't you doing it?
No.
Oh. Public
because he's British.
Public backlash was strong enough to pressure art vendors and buyers to withdraw their support. Brooks, on the other hand, lived a far quieter life in prison, largely refusing interviews and avoiding public attention. He died of complications from COVID-19 in 2020, leaving Henley as the sole remaining member of Corll's Twisted Trio. Now in his 70s, Henley continues to serve his sentence, occasionally granting interviews where he reflects on the years he spent under Corll's influence. In recent years, forensic technology has enabled law enforcement to continue identifying Corll's victims, offering closure to families who have waited decades for answers. DNA testing and genetic genealogy have helped identify some of these previously unidentified victims. In a recent breakthrough, forensics experts released a digital reconstructed image of a boy referred to as John Doe 1973, hoping someone might recognize him and bring his story to a close. And I know that was done as recently as 2023. Corll's mother, who remained unaware of the full extent of her son's crimes until after his death, had reportedly sent him inspirational books.
Wait, so she knew about to some extent before his death?
Well, remember, even from early on, that young man had reported to her that...
Oh, and she fired him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So she maybe didn't know everything, but she knew her son was participating in activity that he shouldn't.
Yeah.
And so, being a really good mom, she would send him inspirational books that would urge him to improve his life and live meaningfully.
I also imagine that the fact that everything came to light after he died, that also has prevented him from becoming a name like John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah. He wasn't there to revel in his criminality.
Yeah. And the Houston Police Department dropped the ball.
Yeah. The Houston mass murders stand as a tragic testament to the importance of community vigilance and accountability. Families who lost sons to Corll's violence continue to memorialize their loved one and often host vigils to raise awareness about the dangers that can lurk within their communities. The case also highlighted the need for law enforcement to address the often overlooked cases of missing persons from lower income neighborhoods, ensuring they receive the same attention as cases from more affluent areas. In the 50 years since Corll's death, Houston Heights has transformed. The once neglected neighborhood has undergone significant gentrification, with new homes and families replacing many of the structures connected to Corll's crimes.
I mean, you said that Henley is still sitting in prison. Do you know which prison he's in?
Elmer Wayne Henley is currently incarcerated at the Stiles Unit in Jefferson County, Texas. In August 2022, when Henley was 66 years old, he applied for compassionate release due to medical reasons. His request for medical parole or compassionate release was denied, and he still remains at the Stiles unit. He has also been reviewed for parole more than 20 times, all of which have been denied.
And he's the only remaining...
Of the three, yeah, he's the only one still left. In conclusion, we want to honor the victims by sharing their names with you now. Jeffrey Conan, James Glass, Danny Yates, Donald Waldrop, Jerry Waldrop, Randall Harvey, David Hilgeist, Gregory Malley-Winkle, Reuben Watson-Haney, Wally Simoneau, Richard Hembry, Joseph Lyles, Homer Garcia, John Sellers, Michael Bulch, Charles Cobble, Marty Jones, and James Stanfield. Jeffrey Conan was hitchhiking. Glass and Yates were both lured away from religious rallies. Jerry Waldrop was lured into Corll's van with the promise of a ride. Randall Harvey was lured under the pretense of offering a ride to a party. Hilgeist and Malley-Winkle were general abductions. Reuben Watson-Haney was persuaded by David Owen Brooks to attend a party. Wally Simoneau, general abduction. John Sellers, general abduction. And Michael Balch, general abduction. And that's all I have for you.
So growing up only an hour and a half away from this, it still is baffling to me that I never heard about this case. As somebody who spent a lot of time when I was younger researching serial killers in particular, it is wild to me that this is the first that I am hearing of this case when there were 28, potentially more than 40 victims, but 28 for sure victims of it. So I appreciate you telling me this case because I can't believe that I haven't found it on my own up until this point.
You're so right, because even though I didn't grow up within an hour and a half proximity to this location, I did grow up in Texas, and my father was so obsessed with Texas and everything not in like a weird, sad way that some people are. Sorry to Texas listeners if you are obsessed in that weird, sad way. You know, it seems like I'm not nailing this part, but nailing.
No, you're definitely nailing it.
And he knew if it happened in Texas and it was a current event or historical event, my dad was like an encyclopedia. He was such a nerd for Texas history. Like when we would go to the bookstore, he would go explicitly to the Texas section and pick out like 4 Texas books to bring home and read. Obsessed. Anyway. With that being said, my father would talk about crazy things that had happened in Texas, historical events, murders that were, I guess, kind of part of the common understanding and knowledge of Texas's social fabric and history. And he never brought this up. And I was also someone who was interested in instances of true crime as a teenager and a young person. I wasn't quite doing research like I think you said you were. Mm-hmm. But it's odd to me that it was something I had not even heard of until I looked up Texas crimes explicitly. Yeah. And I think I came to it by actually Googling Texas cold cases. And because there is the one victim that hasn't been identified, I think John Doe 1973. Mm-hmm. I think that's why it even came across
That's how it
my
registered.
Screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I would have never have heard of
the Candyman,
the Houston mass murders or the Candyman murders. I mean, I know of things that are obvious like the Texas killing fields, but...
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this case.
Canadians.
We just want to shout you out. Thank you so much for listening from up there. We have quite a few listeners in Canada.
Up there, over there, on the other side of the Great Lakes.
All around.
Russia's neighbor.
I think we're specific to like one province. Canada.
BC, Vancouver.
No, we've got a very large listenership
Ontario.
in Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan. Wow. Thank you, Saskatchewan listeners.
Thank you so much.
I mean, also every listener. We're thankful for you.
Yes.
But we love to be international.
Oh, yeah.
International divas.
100%.
Canada versus the world.
It's another one of those Drag Race references. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. And go back and revisit those old episodes that you haven't listened to yet.
Recommend us to a friend and make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
And like us on Facebook at Until the End of Crime. And join our discussion group.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so send us an email with episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.